if you want to disrupt, you kind of got to be the first mover in your market.
Welcome to Future Perfect Tech, a webinar and podcast series by Harbor Research. Each month, we'll be having discussions with the leading experts in smart systems and the Internet of Things on innovations in markets, technologies, and ecosystems that are working together to build a better future.
I do believe in the strange way I'm sold. Do we have the model?
We're thrilled to be here today with Guneet Bedi, Senior VP and General Manager for the Americas at relayr, a leader in the fast-growing software sector known as Industrial Internet of Things, or IIoT for short. I first heard about relayr back in 2013 when the company's co-founders reached out for some strategic advice. Well, I stayed in touch, followed developments from the sidelines, and I actually remember hearing about Guneet joining the company in 2016 and thinking, what a great addition, because Guneet brings so many years of relevant experience to relayr, including his time as GM of one of Cisco's IoT business units. And now at relayr, Guneet leads the global sales team overseeing all sales, business development, and revenue generation efforts. Guneet has been at the proverbial technology coalface for so many years, and always when there's been something interesting going on. From service-oriented architecture to business intelligence applications, onto the Internet of Things, and now the Industrial Internet of Things, which is exactly what we're going to be focusing on in this fascinating discussion. So Guneet, thanks so much for being here today.
Absolutely, and really good to be here. And I'm so glad this is a podcast with no video, because after that introduction, you hope you're 6'5" and big, broad shoulders, which I'm not. But I'm very excited to be here and talk to you about relayr and our experience.
Fantastic. Okay, and we also have, as usual, Glenn Allmendinger, President and Founder of Harbor Research. Glenn, you want to say hello?
Hi, everybody. And Guneet, thank you very much for joining. We're very much looking forward to hearing more about relayr's story as it has evolved and how it will evolve into the future.
Fantastic. So getting started, relayr leads with the term industrial IoT. And at Harbor, we speak a lot about the difficulty in defining terms like Internet of Things, which, even though it seems like a recent trend, has actually been around for more than 30 years in various guises and has different meanings to different stakeholders. So from your perspective, Guneet, what is the industrial IoT? What led you to this place? What led you to this space in the industry? And why should people care about it?
I think, the word industrial in front of IoT or Internet of Things is not just a word, I think, which is to be minimized, because we really believe that industrial scenarios, industrial companies, assets, B2B deserve special attention, deserve itself to be a market segment by itself, not just with the size, but by how different it is from a consumer home or a commercial IoT application, right? And be it technologies, be it, go to market, be it adoption, we feel this is the market we're focused on. And I think this is a market which deserves a segment itself versus just, calling it a smart home or a commercial IoT. We'll talk a little bit more about this. As you know, we're an industrial IoT company, which is an independent subsidiary of the largest reinsurance company, munichray. And, munichray and Hartford Steamboat, our parent companies, focus on industrial insurance only. So there are very, very, specific applications of what we do, which is why I think industrial IoT is what we do.
And Glenn, I know from our previous conversations that you also have a few words and thoughts to say about the evolution of the terminology in this space.
Yeah, I think the challenge has become, if you put 6 people in a room and ask them what IoT is, they'll give you 8 to 10 definitions or points of view. I think, this goes back to ubiquitous computing, pervasive computing, machine to machine, and on it's gone. And I think because of those earlier chapters and those earlier labels, in many respects, there's a lot of people who've reduced IoT to just mean connecting, essentially assets in the physical world to the internet and other networks. We've been calling this smart systems for several years now just to try and avoid the acronyms. But I think to Guneet's point, which I strongly agree with, IoT within a consumer or a home or residential context or even a commercial context doesn't really address the the mission criticality and the nature of the things that go on in the industrial environment. And I think, the returns and the potential impact in the industrial space is, different than other commercial and consumer arenas, but will have a huge impact. And I think this is the place where it's a little complex and some interesting challenges and a lot of moving parts. But I think in many respects, it's really just about the linking together of all these intelligent assets in a way that you can leverage the data and the value that data can bring in analysis and knowledge.
Well, it's exactly to those challenges that I'd like to turn now. And from all the conversations, or just about all the conversations with our clients, we hear about this hurdle to adoption. We often hear about how difficult it is to corral the resources to deal with the complexity in launching even a proof of concept. There's technical trade-offs. There's a lack of understanding of what's available in terms of technologies and platforms and the network options for any of these deployments. And then, of course, the difficulty deciding what data to collect and what results would equate to success. So, Guneet, given all of that, what challenges do you specifically see? What have you perhaps solved already? And what do you see is still remaining to be addressed?
And it is hard. And, you said it in the introduction. You found out I joined relayr in 2016 and I'm talking to you in 2021. It took us a good 5 years to even come to a place where we think we've solved some challenges. But, I'll probably bucket the challenges in three segments, right? The first one is the big challenge of the right outcome and the right business outcome. Because, it's not like consumer IoT where you can connect a bunch of assets and there are so many models that you can use to monetize this data and monetize the application. And it's interesting in the industrial and, B2B world, you got to really start with the outcome. And like you said, which will dictate all the technology architectures. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's the first bucket. I think the second bucket we see, Glenn said it well, we call it Internet of Legacy things sometimes, because in the industrial world, assets last for, between 20 to 50 years. And it's not about, hey, I put in a smart home device and it's not good enough and I'll replace it with another one, because these are $200,000 to $1 million assets and they stay in the field forever. So it is so important for us to solve the legacy and the existing install base. We have a very successful practice in the elevator markets, and you won't believe how old elevators we see, right? And some of them from the World War II time in Europe. And the whole idea being, we need to retrofit them and we need to make sure that the technology solution as well as the go-to-market solves for that. So that's, the second big challenge. It's about legacy. And the third challenge is there are no cookie cutter case studies out there on how you make it successful. If you want to disrupt, you kind of got to be the first mover in your market. And, with first mover, the classic innovation or the inventor's dilemma, you got to really figure things out, and some stuff you will do wrong and some stuff you will do right and get better. So I think that's the big challenges I see. I'd love to get Glenn's opinion, but the business outcome is where you need to start, focus on the legacy install base to solve the problem. And, you're really trailblazing here, whether if you're a service provider or you're a manufacturer of equipment, and there is nothing for you to look and copy. You got to really start from scratch and develop it.
I strongly agree, Guneet. I guess might be worth making a distinction about is, in many cases, it is the equipment and the asset players who are largely trying to leverage industrial IoT, and obviously as well as end customers. But in many cases, it's kind of like a Typhoid Mary analogy. They, an OEM will drag this kind of technology into somebody's plant, and I think it tends to spread like a disease after that. But the OEMs have, they come from a culture, no matter how complex the equipment is. I sell a machine, I parachute that machine into somebody's manufacturing operations, and I wait for them to call me after it breaks or they need a spare part. And so I think the complexity is just all of the moving parts and complexity of these systems, I think, is probably in many respects the thing that I think many users find very daunting. Of course, once you get past the plumbing diagram or the wiring diagram or the integration story, I think it then shifts to, essentially what are you going to do with the data and how do you think about data in this context, and often considerably greater amounts of data than I think people have really dealt with in simple monitoring kinds of applications in the past. And then that inevitably leads to, Guneet, your point, which is, the outcome is just a different way of saying what's the design of the business thing that I'm actually trying to accomplish.
We often encourage our clients to overcome these adoption hurdles by taking a more creative approach to business models. For example, taking an ecosystem-driven approach where you're not doing everything alone and instead relying on a network of partners. Glenn, what do you think is critical for success in launching these type of projects?
Well, I echo Guneet's point earlier, which is first understanding the goalpost and what's the business outcome you're trying to get to. But I think, I guess the easiest way to characterize this is because there's a certain level of complexity or greater of these kinds of solutions, I would say just determining what whoever's looking at this, what their role is going to be in this. And do I in fact, would I be better off with a partner like relayr or others, and everything from, obviously upstream design and testing and proof of concepts to, staging and deployment to support. All of this has gotten considerably more complex with lots more layers. And so understanding your skills and capabilities and then essentially converting that into a better understanding or objective understanding of, what role are you going to play in this versus others, and then who else to invite to the solution party, if you will, I think are all questions that sometimes people either don't fully answer or make, essentially incomplete choices about all the different aspects and dimensions that need to be addressed. I don't know. What do you think, Guneet? I think that's roles and outcomes and models, I think, are very important things to have nailed down before you start spending money and doing things and building things.
Totally agree, Glenn. And I think, it's a really interesting point you brought up because, somebody asked me, hey, who are you? Who's relayr? Are you an IoT platform company in the industrial world? Are you a solution provider? And, we came up with this word, right or wrong, saying, no, we're actually an ecosystem orchestrator, right? Because as you know, we're a part of an insurance company. So we build, we have 300 plus people building really sophisticated artificial intelligence, AI and IoT technologies, but we do it very close to a guarantee or an insurance offer, which itself is in orchestration. And of course, we don't know anything about insurance, but our parent company does. So that's the first ecosystem provider. Like I said, there's a lot of legacy equipment involved. So of course we need retrofit kits and hardware expertise and, last mile connectivity expertise. We don't have that, but we go to partners. So, I think having very clear swim lanes and guardrails of, hey, what role do we play? And, this gets even more important when we get into the industrial ecosystem, right? All the way from an end customer to, like you said, an OEM or a manufacturer. Then they have a beautiful service provider distributor market, which is quite a few billions in the US. Also, how do they play their parts? And we call it vertical integration, if you may, just a standard term. But is our OEMs forward integrating? Our service providers backward integrating? And of course, everybody wants to eat everybody else's lunch. So I think a lot of practical models I'm happy to discuss today, if you all want, is how do we play those roles so that everybody wins versus somebody trying to kind of compete with each other.
It's exactly that, those models that I'd like to dive into now. One of the defining aspects of software today is the subscription model. And it seems that everything is offered as a service, from streaming music to movies to purchasing hardware and accessing data. Why is the subscription model so important to industrial IoT? And if everything is offered as a service, do you see or encounter any subscription fatigue?
Yeah, really good question. And, I think sometimes people think they want to do subscription just because it's subscription, but subscription may not be good in every case. In the industrial world, Bain had a very interesting article on this, but it's interesting how the interest of the operators, the end customers who use, let's say, a laser cutting machine is totally not aligned with the interest of the laser cutting manufacturer, right? Because, the manufacturer sells a big CapEx kind of deal, goes away for 15, 20 years, loses touch, and they're actually incentivized initially to build a really high quality machine which doesn't fail. But if the machines don't fail, they don't make any aftermarket revenue. And of course, the end customer don't want the machine to go down. So it's an interesting dilemma of the value and the interests are not aligned. And I think what subscription does in our mind is aligns those interests. Again, Bain mentioned this, but we see, 10 to 15% total cost of ownership savings for the end customer. But that 10 to 15% cost savings comes with much more customer intimacy, if you may, so that's the right word, because, you are actually working as a service provider or as an OEM on a regular basis with the customer because you have a subscription service. And in the case of a subscription service, you have to stay in touch with the customer and you kind of have to stay in touch with to earn that revenue, if you may, of course, which comes with the side effect of predictable revenues, and, there's no surprise that in the, hardware and the software world where I come from, I basically took Cisco's hardware IoT business and tried to create, recurring revenue, which Cisco's done very successfully. And, Oracle did that, the decade before with databases. But the idea being it is 4 or 5x more revenue. So I think subscription in our mind definitely increases the dollar value and the revenue. But more importantly, we think creates this alignment of interest, which is really, really missing in the industrial world specifically.
Guneet, I think that really was a great portrayal of the disconnect between most of the equipment people on the planet and their users and the owners of all those assets. I mean, basically, it's really just a continuous relationship throughout the life cycle of the asset or the piece of equipment. And so, whether it's a robot or a machine tool or a conveyor or a forklift truck, in the old model, you bought it, it was delivered, you wait for it to break, and then you went and found a spare part, and if that didn't fix it, you then called the OEM, and that's the first time they've seen the thing in use in your life. And I think, Guneet, you're absolutely correct. The alignment of goals and outcomes and the intimacy and the value of the information that's shared between the equipment manufacturer and the user become wildly more robust and much more real time in nature. And that knowledge, I think really puts you in a position to accumulate and build that knowledge base in a way that benefits everybody. But the fact that it's continuous to me is the simple magic that lies under the whole subscription model, particularly for the industrial world, which probably prior to 5 years ago probably couldn't spell the word subscription.
Large technology, big tech, OEMs have often been maligned and gained the reputation and the perception that they're slow adopters. Is that a fair criticism? And if so, who are the fast adopters? And what might the larger players learn from the faster adopters?
And I think perception is a very good word there, because I don't think the industrial world is just sitting on their chairs and not doing anything. One simple data point, we do a survey of 200 to 300 CXOs in the industrial world every year. And, during the pandemic and right after, this year's survey showed us that close to 50% of US businesses want to change the way they take products to customers and, look at subscription. And twice as many US businesses than, in other parts of the world are thinking about this. And on top of that, 47% of German companies said, hey, we're looking at industrial IoT, we're looking at AI. So again, I think people get a bad rep, but there are some people who are really, disrupting their markets. First of all, we see a lot of examples, but we see the service providers and distributors, which are right in the middle, as one element of fast adopters. We see companies in the pump space, in the mining space, in elevators, in boilers, compressors, power generation, the really meat and potatoes market. They're all machine tools is another example, heavy industrial machinery like skids on the upstream oil and gas. So there are a lot of, first of all, service companies which are starting to do this and starting to experiment on the right business models, of course, with the right technology. We do see a lot of asset classes, we call them, so for example, rotating equipment is an asset class. where if the utilization is really high of the asset or really low, so it's interesting, either they're less than 15% utilization or, really high 90% plus utilization, as a service model start making a lot more sense. Uptime and availability start making a lot of sense. And of course, there's some minor geographical differences where, for example, Germany, which is our parent, country where we're based out of, as you know, they're a little bit more conservative. They want to get the solution right before they go big bang launch, whereas some of the American companies are moving faster. The only place where I think there is fair criticism is the manufacturers and OEMs are slower than at least we think they should be. And this is just the world according to Guneet and relayr, but I wish they were faster. But that's what I is my perspective, and I'd love to get Glenn's perspective in this too.
I agree with all of that. I think the other maybe more intangible dimension to this, particularly to your last point in the OEM and equipment manufacturer world, is the speed and precision with which they adopt new technologies. I think correlates pretty heavily to their evolution within their own business model with services. And so there's still a lot of OEMs out there that really don't do any service and don't really understand very much about essentially how their equipment's really getting used and whatever type of process it's involved in. And, they have spare parts and a fairly classic kind of aftermarket story. But, like the rotating, precision rotating equipment example, Guneet, you brought up, I think that's a great example. Turbines, obviously, but, high-end pumps, compressors, all of those kinds of businesses have been through a more aggressive embrace of services and value and doing more things directly with customers. And so the same spirit as the earlier subscription and continuous relationship story, those that are further along in the maturity of their services and understand the value of those services and the direct interaction with the end users of these pieces of equipment, I think generally do better at this because they've already addressed a much broader and somewhat more complex business model.
And as many of our listeners will know, relayr was acquired by risk management insurance company munichray in 2018. And I remember this very distinctly. I used to be an M&A practitioner and keen observer of the M&A market. And this deal was, I think, really one of the most innovative I've seen and surprising I've seen. I think it really took a lot of people by surprise. I think that the promise of the combination is huge, is supporting customers in very innovative ways, which, might take or probably has already taken the form of offering financial and insurance support to really speed up adoption. Guneet, can you speak to a little bit to that and what other ways that the combination might be supporting your customers?
Absolutely. And I think, as coming from the technology world, we did not know that insurance, and especially industrial world insurance, would be that attractive to us as well as, that's the combination. And at the heart of it, when you're going with any new offer and any new disruption, you are creating risk. And, how a lot of us in the technology world, a lot of us in the manufacturing and industrial world think of risk is bad. But insurance thinks of risk as good, right? So we said, okay, why not we put the two heads together? And, there are really three areas of risk you create when you do any new offers, as a service or subscription. There is financial, market, and strategic risk. And, that's an element which is not that controllable, but understood very well by someone like munichray. I mean, they insure against pandemics. They insure against solar outages, power outages, what happened in Texas recently. So, they kind of understand some of this risk. And we feel if we can combine the, your own company's risk and outsource some of this financial marketing and, market and strategic risks, it makes a really interesting combination. Of course, the second big risk outside of the strategic risk is a cultural and organizational readiness risk, which, I think a lot of companies have to manage themselves, but can be managed with guidance. And, for example, if we as relayr have been doing it for 7 years, we've learned a lot of lessons. We have a lot of war stories. I'm sure other companies do too. So why not leverage, the experience? And of course, the third is the execution risk, right? Can you execute? And that is the risk which the companies have to take themselves. And, we see, for example, a company like Flanders, which is a service provider for motors and pumps or, high precision rotating equipment in Evansville, Indiana, which have taken a lower complexity approach to say, hey, let's go out, let's monitor assets, let's get them to uptime and availability. I mean, their tagline is zero unplanned outage or zero unplanned downtime. And if they can get there with their own expertise and technology, then we can start putting very innovative insurance policies on top of that. We can put uptime insurance. We can put revenue insurance. We can put business interruption insurance. So, that's where the lower complexity leading to higher complexity can be very, very interesting and exciting. But then there are companies on the other side, for example, a public partnership with Trumpf, the largest laser cutting giant out of Germany, who are completely disrupting this and saying, we're going to charge pay-per-use. You never pay for a Trumpf machine again, which are expensive. But if you use the machine and you cut, the sheet metal, we're going to give you a pay-per-use model where the complexity and risk is very high. And we're starting with munichray, taking a lot of that risk off their balance sheet. So I think that's what is, very innovative. And I think this will evolve. And that's what the approach we have been taking on.
Do you see yourself heading towards, equipment as a service, manufacturing as a service, even, through the OEM? Really the Trumpf example, do you see that expanding, Guneet, over time?
Glenn, that's a phenomenal question. And that's, I think, the holy grail. So, we have started the journey with creating financial models, with creating special purpose vehicles. And we've started doing this with Trumpf and a few others, which will be publicly launched soon. But yes, equipment as a service where you do not pay the big capex upfront and you pay a lot of the ongoing costs, which includes aftermarket, includes uptime guarantees, includes consumables, is really where we are seeing a lot of the big OEMs go. And of course, the service providers, like I said, are taking the other smaller complexity approach where they're taking more like a maintenance budget guarantee kind of approach versus an as a service approach. But we see both the approaches and we are really getting ready. We have the insurance piece figured out. We have the technology piece to a lot of extent figured out. And now we're figuring out the financial engineering off balance sheet, special purpose vehicle based approach where we can take the completely as a service models.
So it's interesting. It really is a risk management. It's a risk management industrial IoT. That's great. Have you all addressed contract manufacturing in this and third party manufacturing yet in any of your activities, Guneet?
It's a good question, and we've been dabbling around that. I wouldn't say we have any public launches and case studies of this being successful.
Well, I think it's early. I think it's very early. In other words, but it plays the same as a service model over time. You could easily see, kind of the decomposition of the classic CapEx, OpEx story of manufacturing over time as you look to the future.
And it can also go, Glenn, in the additive manufacturing space. But I think that, it'll take some time. Like I said, the fastest adoption we see is in the service provider space, followed by some very forward-thinking OEMs. And I'm sure it'll get to exactly where you're saying. And I hope, we can help the market get there.
I'm sure you can. Generally, my predictions are about 10 years off.
Well, from my perspective, I think it's a very interesting way to look at it. And I think that, one of the big challenges in this whole space is trying to calculate ROI in advance of projects. And when you see the difficulty of locking in that ROI and you're putting that against a very definitive amount of investment that has to be made up front, I think what you're doing with the model that you're putting out to the market is very interesting because it effectively shares risk, right? It basically takes the 100% burden and spreads it across several different shoulders. And so I think that this whole model, I think, will essentially accelerate adoption through the industry. And I see relayr as being the leader in this kind of spearhead approach to making it easier to both get started, as well as easier and more consistent and easier to plan these projects. That's the way I'm processing this. Would that be a fair estimation? Is it panning out that way?
It's a very kind and nice way, and thank you for giving all the kudos to us. But yes, I think it's a good, fair assumption with the one, kind of important point, Owen, that all of this is absolutely new. And you're right, we're trying to spearhead the market, which of course makes, tells us we will make mistakes and, we will get some stuff wrong, but hopefully we get more right than wrong. And I think you said it very well. If we can spread the risk over multiple ecosystem parties, then everybody takes their own risk. We take the risk of innovative new, for example, we're trying to do all our contracts gain share for this exact reason, because, ROI looks really good on Excel sheets and paper. And then when you hit the reality and trying to get the first few assets onboarded, you realize where ROI could be. But, if we can, for example, align with our partners and customers to say, hey, we will make money if you make money. Now we could get burnt in a few places, but hopefully that's the right approach. So I think you summarized it very well with the added complexity that is still a very high risk approach. And, if everybody can spread risk around, then, we can all as an industry go successfully to those models.
No, I was just saying, this goes back to your ecosystem orchestrator. Risk management becomes kind of like an abstraction layer that sits on top of, classes of equipment like turbo machinery or, precision rotating equipment. And, but then you're orchestrating that risk across the, essentially key ecosystem partners. It's quite an innovative model. It's quite impressive.
Well, I think it also comes down to signaling. In many ways, a poorly understood phenomenon in purchasing decisions. But the way I look at it, what you're doing with your most recent deals and projects is that you're essentially signaling to the market that you're not going to leave your clients alone to shoulder everything themselves. And I think that's one of the things that technology often could be accused of, is that they come up with these great innovations and then price them and essentially throw them over the wall to their customers. Well, here you go. Now you're kind of on your own. And of course, there's support and all the rest of it. But I think you're taking a much more sophisticated approach to this. And it's the signaling, I think, that is so effective, and that you're signaling to your clients, your customers, that you're not going to leave them alone, because you have a high self-interest to ensure that the technology does deliver to a great extent against that ROI. And you're going to win when they win.
That's the hope. And you summarize it very well, Owen. That's exactly what we're trying to do.
Well, if we extend the time horizon somewhat and we look a little bit more into the future, what do you see, Guneet? Where is the market really heading once we get our heads out of the current situation and we're looking in a post-COVID world and things somewhat, hopefully, return to some sense of normality? Where is the future for industrial IoT?
Glenn will appreciate the first part of my answer, but I am pretty horrible at predictions from my March Madness bracket. I get every team wrong, but I will still make a prediction. I think from our perspective, what we think is there are 2 or 3 trends. I think the first is, like I said, this vertical integration will happen in manufacturing and industrial. Whether it's OEMs and manufacturers trying to get into the more continued customer relationship and services space, which, in a lot of sense will compete a little bit with the service providers and distributors. So they'll try and forward integrate. There will backward integration happen from the service providers who are basically saying, hey, Mr. Customer, work with me because I know how your equipment works. And doesn't matter which OEM is in there. So there's some backward integration and there's some very interesting, healthy tension, I'd say. And I predict there will be more vertical integration. There will absolutely be OEMs forward integrating. There will absolutely be distributors and service providers backward integrating. That's one. I do see, especially with the pandemic, the second trend of focused investments around, this whole subscription technology and predictability. Like I said, 50% of US companies want to do a new model. 47% of German companies want to use IoT and AI. So I think there will be more investments in this space. And the third space, which I predict, but it's very early, there will be totally new roles and responsibilities and new work culture and new skills that manufacturing companies will need. The workforce, I think, will change. it's really early for us to say how it will change, but it will change. And I think there'll be a lot of reskilling needed when we become, remote IoT, AI, and, we don't have to depend on the human intelligence of and the experience of the technicians, which is in, retiring workforce. So I'd say those three is what is top of mind for us, Owen.
Glenn, from Harbor's perspective, what are the top predictions for the next 5 years in this space?
Well, I think we've spoken about one of them, which is more or less what relayr is doing, which is essentially smoothing out the speed bumps on the road of adoption to these technologies. I think, whether it's a subscription model, whether it's being able to manage the risk in these things, I just think a lot of people have focused after all of the troubles that we have had on trying to make this, a simpler and easier and more straightforward road for adoption. I think the second thing that won't come right away, but I used to describe the overworld versus the underworld, and the overworld was general IT and enterprise context, and the underworld was the manufacturing and industrial world. And but sooner or later, the industrial world, I think that in more advanced industries with more advanced equipment and more advanced partners like what relayr is doing with these OEMs, they're all going to eventually wake up and need to understand how to get their arms around all the data in these plants. And I think we're just scratching at that surface, but that becomes an enabler, I think, to the third trend, which is, the full value of machine learning or AI or any of these other, essentially more advanced smart systems kinds of technologies is largely dependent upon, not everybody has all of the data from their thing that contributes to all the data that allows you to model these kinds of processes. And so, as ecosystems evolve and roles become more explicitly focused on these kinds of things and people understand how to get their arms around the data, there's huge efficiency and productivity and new innovation impacts, I think, coming with machine learning that I think will be significant. And, the more we have players like relayr in the marketplace doing this smoothing of adoption and making it easier to take on this complexity, I think the faster we get there. And I think, in many respects, you might even be able to say that you could move up the speedometer a little bit on the traditionally very slow and conservative industrial space. I think that's possible.
Well, Guneet, this has been an absolute pleasure for me personally because, of my own history with going back to 2013 with relayr and encouraging relayr to join up to start a boot camp, and then the amazing progress in the interim of the acquisition, and then seeing relayr just really grow into its own and become one of the, if not the leading innovator in this space. It's so wonderful to see and just a great success story. So thank you so much for being part of our podcast, delivering some really fantastic insights and up-to-the-minute commentary on where the market is today. So thanks again from all of us at Harbor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Guneet. It's been great talking.
Absolutely, Glenn and Owen. This has been a pleasure, and I really look forward to staying in touch and appreciate all the kind and nice remarks. And Owen, thank you for being a supporter for so many years.
To listen to the full podcast, as well as other episodes featuring conversations with innovators in smart systems technologies, go to harborresearch.com/future-perfect-tech.